I have spent most of my life studying businesses, capital, incentives, and the strange ways money changes human behavior. When I was younger, I looked at balance sheets and income statements and thought the world was mostly a contest of skill. I thought good management created value, bad management destroyed it, and the market sorted the difference out over time. Age teaches you that this is only part of the story. The harder lesson is that a society can become very good at rewarding the extraction of value while becoming very bad at protecting the conditions that allow value to be created in the first place. That is where I believe America has wandered. A great many young people think their trouble began with high rent, impossible home prices, student debt, expensive groceries, layoffs, vanishing, and a healthcare system that feels like a toll booth at the edge of every emergency. Those are real problems, but they are not the beginning of the story. The beginning is that an entire financial culture learned how to make money by buying the foundations of ordinary life with borrowed money, loading the bill onto the thing being bought, paying itself on the way out, and leaving everyone else to live with the wreckage. Once you see that mechanism clearly, a lot of what looks confusing starts to look perfectly consistent. You stop seeing separate headlines. You start seeing one machine. A retailer collapses. A hospital cuts staff. A housing community raises lot rents. A manufacturer gets hollowed out. A nursing home becomes more dangerous. A young family gives up on buying a house. A pension fund takes losses it never understood. An economy becomes more expensive, more fragile, and less humane at the exact same time. Most people are told these are isolated failures. I do not believe they are. I believe they are often the natural output of a system that has made debt-fueled extraction look sophisticated and patience look naive. In my world, people like to talk about efficiency. Efficiency is a beautiful word when it describes removing waste. It becomes an ugly word when it means taking a real enterprise, fastening a mountain of debt onto it, cutting labor, selling assets, squeezing customers, and calling the result improved performance. That is not always capitalism at its best. Quite often, it is capitalism eating its seed corn. The easiest place to understand this is with the old leveraged buyout logic. Imagine you want control of a business worth $100. You could put up the full 100 yourself. That would be honest, but it would limit your upside and expose your capital. So you do something far more attractive. You contribute a small sliver, you borrow the rest, and the debt does not stay with you. The debt gets strapped to the company. Now the company has to carry the burden. Now the workers, customers, suppliers, and the long-term health of the business have to live inside your financing decision. If the company bends but survives, you look like a genius. If the company is forced to cut, strip, shrink, delay, and squeeze just to make the numbers work, you call it discipline. If the company stumbles into bankruptcy after you have already paid yourself through fees, dividends, and financial engineering, that is somebody else's tragedy. This is one of the oldest temptations in finance. Use little of your own money. Control a lot of assets. Push the obligations downward. Pull the rewards upward. Socialize the damage. Privatize the gain. People hear a term like private equity and imagine exclusive rooms, polished presentations, and talented operators who know how to improve troubled assets. Sometimes there are talented operators. Sometimes companies do need stronger management. Sometimes capital really does rescue something worth saving. I am not foolish enough to claim every deal is destructive, but I am old enough to know what happens when an industry is built around incentives that reward a fast payout more than durable stewardship. The language gets gentler while the behavior gets larger. The old barbarians at the gate change the tailoring of their suits, gather more institutional capital, and become respectable. The leverage stays, the hunger stays, the habit of using other people's balance sheets to reach for your own return stays. That is why the rebranding matters less to me than the structure. If a system repeatedly produces layoffs, weakened enterprises, unstable communities, poorer service, and richer sponsors, then the system is telling you what it is designed to do. You should listen. Young people are living inside the consequences of that design. They are told they are entitled because housing feels unreachable. They are told they do not work hard enough because wages do not cover the cost of becoming independent. They are told they eat too much takeout, buy too much coffee, and spend too much time online. I have no doubt that personal discipline matters. It always matters. But personal discipline is not a complete explanation when the floor under a generation has been repeatedly sold, securitized, refinanced, and repriced against them. If you enter adulthood when homes have become financial inventory, healthcare has become a debt conduit. Entry-level jobs are being cut or devalued, and every basic service seems to come with a monthly extraction attached to it. You are not merely facing a budgeting problem. You are facing a structure. That structure has been especially cruel in housing. A shortage of homes is painful enough. An affordability shortage is worse. But it becomes something more corrosive when large pools of capital decide that the next great business is not simply lending against houses. It is owning the houses, owning the neighborhoods, owning the land, under the manufactured home communities, and turning shelter itself into a recurring yield product. When that happens, a home stops being primarily a place to build family life and long-term security. It becomes a cash flow stream for somebody far away. A young couple sees a down payment as the mountain they cannot climb. An investor sees the same market and asks how many doors can be accumulated, how many lots can be repriced, how much rent can be increased before tenants break, and how much debt can be placed on the structure supporting it all. One side experiences shelter as necessity. The other experiences shelter as inventory. Those are not equal positions at the bargaining table. If you want to know why a generation feels like it is renting its future 1 month at a time, start there. Start with the simple truth that the ownership of necessities has migrated into hands that measure success differently from the families trying to live inside those necessities. That same logic has moved through healthcare. Nothing exposes a civilization faster than the place where life and death meet cost accounting. A hospital is not a steel mill. A nursing home is not a strip mall. An ambulance service is not an app. But if the governing question becomes how quickly margins can be raised, staffing can be trimmed, and debt can be carried, then even care starts to lose its moral center. People talk about productivity as if it were morally neutral. In many industries it is. In healthcare, productivity can hide a darker reality. You can understaff until the remaining workers are exhausted. You can delay investment. You can reduce full-time staff and fill gaps in fragile ways. You can tell yourself the system is still functioning because the doors are technically open. Then the infections rise. Then the falls rise. Then the mistakes rise. Then the quiet quality of care that keeps catastrophe from appearing in the first place begins to disappear. I do not need a spreadsheet to tell me that a society that treats emergency rooms, hospitals, elder care, and mental health facilities as balance sheet opportunities before treating them as human obligations is moving in the wrong direction. What alarms me is not just that this is happening. What alarms me is how normal people have become in talking about it, as if higher mortality, thinner staffing, and more brittle care are simply unfortunate but acceptable side effects of financial sophistication. That is the sort of moral drift that usually arrives before the numbers finish telling the full story. Jobs tell a similar story when people say younger workers should just adapt. I ask a simple question. Adapt to what? Adapt to an economy that destroys the exact kinds of jobs young adults historically used as launch pads. Adapt to service work that pays too little relative to rent. Adapt to retail and consumer businesses that are cut for debt service and short-term presentation. Adapt to manufacturing rhetoric that promises revival while the actual industrial base stays vulnerable to the same financial pressures that weakened it before. Adapt to a world where entry-level work is scarce, credential expectations rise, and the basic cost of staying alive keeps climbing. Young adults can and should learn skills. They should save, read, work, and build resilience. I would tell any grandson of mine the same thing, but I would also tell him not to confuse individual responsibility with the fantasy that the broader game is fair. A generation can make mistakes. A generation can also inherit a deeply distorted playing field. Both can be true at once. The damage becomes even greater when pensions and endowments get pulled into the process. This is the part ordinary citizens rarely see clearly. A deal maker may present himself as bold, but the capital is often not truly his. Large institutions provide the equity. Credit markets provide the leverage. The target company provides the balance sheet that absorbs the strain. Then the beneficiaries of a pension plan or the donors to an endowment are told they are participating in advanced investing, while the actual operating companies that underpin communities are being turned into vessels for financial extraction. It is a strange arrangement. Workers save for retirement. Their savings are allocated into strategies that may help finance the weakening of the businesses, labor markets, housing access, or care systems those same workers depend upon. That circularity should bother more people than it does. It tells you how detached the financial system has become from any coherent sense of stewardship. The result is a society where enormous pools of capital can destroy value in one place, report attractive returns in another place, and still be described as prudent allocators of capital. I have spent too much time around markets to be romantic about them. Markets are not churches, but even markets require a culture. They require rules, incentives, and social expectations that prevent the strongest participants from strip mining the future just because it is possible. When those restraints weaken, you get a different economy. You get one where a company can be bought with debt, squeezed for output, refinanced through private credit, and kept alive in appearance even as its underlying resilience deteriorates. That brings me to the next layer of the danger. Private credit. Most people hear that phrase and their eyes glaze over. They should not. Whenever lending migrates outside the old banking channels, grows rapidly, relies on optimistic assumptions, and flourishes in the shadows of weaker transparency, I become interested. Not to put us every loan is bad, because opacity is the oldest friend of excess. If the same broad ecosystem that helped load businesses with debt now also becomes the ecosystem refinancing that debt through private lending vehicles, then the circle closes in an uncomfortable way. The sponsor buys the asset, the debt burdens the asset, the operating performance weakens or strains, the refinancing arrives from another corner of a less transparent market. The valuation assumptions stay hopeful. Liquidity looks sufficient until too many people want it at once. This is how fragility often grows. Not with one dramatic trumpet blast, with layer upon layer of confidence built on the belief that refinancing will remain available, marks will remain flattering, redemptions will remain manageable, and the real economy will cooperate long enough for the structure to hold. That sort of confidence can survive a long time, right up until it cannot. I have lived through enough cycles to know that what appears stable in illiquid markets often enjoys a luxury public markets do not. It is not forced to admit the truth every day. That can be a blessing when businesses need time. It can also be a disguise when values have drifted from reality. And when a society has already weakened its labor market, strained household budgets, financialized housing, and stretched public balance sheets, the margin for another major debt accident grows thinner. This is where younger generations face an especially bitter inheritance. If the next large financial cleanup arrives, who is expected to absorb it? The generation with cheap homes and huge savings cushions, or the generation already paying high rent, facing uncertain work, delaying family formation, skipping medical care, and watching asset prices float beyond reach? The answer is not hard to guess. In every cycle, the people with the least cushion are told to be patient, while the people closest to capital find ways to protect themselves. That pattern has repeated often enough that I no longer mistake it for bad luck. Now, it would be easy for me to sit here and end with total despair. There is plenty in the facts to justify a dark mood. A country can only tolerate so much extraction before trust itself begins to fray. And when trust frays, every institution becomes harder to repair. But I do not believe in surrender as a philosophy. I have never believed that outrage by itself is a strategy. If a young person listening to me concludes that the game is dirty, therefore discipline no longer matters, that would be the second tragedy. The first tragedy would be the system. The second tragedy would be letting the system train you into cynicism so deep that you stop building any habits of strength at all. You must not do that. You must see the machine clearly without becoming machine, like yourself. That distinction matters. The large system can be corrupt and still leave room for individual conduct, local repair, and small acts of leadership that slowly reintroduce order into daily life. I am not saying small acts can replace structural reform. They cannot. A person pushing in a chair does not solve housing. A decent landlord in one town does not solve national affordability. A thoughtful nurse does not heal a broken financing model. A fair manager does not unwind decades of financial engineering. But I know something important about character. Societies do not recover through outrage alone. They recover when enough people stop using corruption above them as an excuse for carelessness within their reach. That is where hope becomes practical rather than decorative. If you run a business, treat your people honestly. If you invest, understand what incentives you are financing. If you work inside a company, refuse the lie that every extraction is efficiency. If you own property, do not squeeze simply because software says you can. If you manage capital for teachers, firefighters, or pensioners, remember that numbers on a quarterly report are claims on real lives. If you are young and feel shut out, do not accept the degrading idea that your only purpose is to become a permanent subscriber to every basic necessity. Learn how money works. Learn how debt works. Learn how incentives work. Learn which businesses create real value and which merely rearrange claims. Learn to save not only for comfort but for independence of judgment. The first dollars you keep are not just money. They are breathing room. They are negotiating power. They are the ability to say no. They are the beginning of refusing a system that wants every pay period spoken for before it arrives. That is true for a household, and it is true for a nation. The people who own their time, hold liquidity, avoid unnecessary debt, and understand incentives are always harder to trap. I would also urge young people to be careful about the kind of success they admire. There is too much applause in modern life for people who are merely good at monetizing friction. I admire people who build products others genuinely need. I admire managers who leave businesses stronger than they found them. I admire doctors, nurses, mechanics, farmers, teachers, operators, and founders who keep real systems functioning. I admire patient capital. I admire stewardship. I admire the quiet sort of competence that improves a place without needing to strip it first. A culture that cannot distinguish between stewardship and extraction eventually loses both wealth and decency. That is the broader danger in what we are watching. This is not merely a financial argument. It is a civilizational one. What kind of country are you building when homes become rent machines, hospitals become debt containers, farms become liquidation targets, jobs become temporary cost lines, and young people are expected to finance the whole arrangement through subscriptions, financing plans, rising rents, and permanent insecurity? That is not a nation investing in the future. That is a nation pawning the future. And once a country develops the habit of pawning tomorrow to flatter today, it becomes very difficult to know where the line is. Why stop at housing if healthcare can be harvested? Why stop at healthcare if food systems can be consolidated? Why stop at companies if communities can be repriced? Why stop at one generation if the next one has not yet accumulated enough power to resist? This is how rot advances. Not because nobody notices, because enough people notice and decide that notice by itself is sufficient. I do not think it is sufficient. I think clarity has to lead to conduct. The first rule is to understand the incentives of any system before you trust its promises. The second rule is to avoid becoming dependent on institutions that profit from your permanent fragility. The third rule is to build enough personal and local strength that you can still act sensibly when larger structures behave foolishly. Those are not glamorous rules. They are not designed for social media. They will not make anybody look clever at a cocktail party, but they can help preserve a sane life inside an increasingly insane environment. And there is one more thought I want to leave with you. Whenever a system becomes too financialized, people begin to feel small. That feeling is dangerous. It convinces them they are spectators in their own society. They stop picking up the mess in front of them because the mess above them is so large. They stop behaving like stewards because the grand stewards have behaved like looters. I understand the temptation. I reject it. Your standards should not collapse because theirs did. If anything, your standards matter more when theirs have failed. Clean up what is near you, honor your work, protect your balance sheet. Help the vulnerable where you can. Support institutions that still remember they exist to serve, rather than extract. Teach your children the difference between ownership and debt masquerading as ownership. Teach them the difference between price and value. Teach them that convenience is not freedom when the bill never stops arriving. Teach them that wealth is not appearances. Wealth is resilience, optionality, and the ability to live without being owned by every monthly obligation in sight. A generation that learns those lessons may still face hardship, but it will at least have a chance to avoid being entirely consumed by the logic that created the hardship. I do believe this country is capable of renewal. I do not believe renewal comes automatically. It will require a cultural refusal, a refusal to celebrate every form of financial cleverness, a refusal to call extraction progress, a refusal to accept that young people should own nothing, rent everything, finance every emergency, postpone every milestone, and be grateful for the privilege that is not a serious social contract, that is surrender dressed up as modernity. If I were 25 today, I would feel the pressure very sharply. I would also know that pressure has a way of clarifying first principles. I would keep my life as unencumbered as possible. I would save aggressively. I would stay away from status spending. I would study incentives harder than headlines. I would choose relationships and work that increase my resilience, not just my image. I would be very selective about debt. I would remember that the more of my future I pre-sell, the easier I am to control. And I would never forget that the world still belongs, in the long run, to people who can build, endure, tell the truth, and keep their heads while fashionable systems are busy eating themselves. That may sound old-fashioned at my age. That does not trouble me. Some truths are old because they keep surviving the collapse of newer lies. The lie of this era is that you can endlessly financialize the foundations of life without degrading life itself. You cannot. Sooner or later, the bill arrives in wages, in rent, in trust, in family formation, in illness, in loneliness, in public anger, in political instability, in a generation that looks at the richest economy in the world and wonders why it feels poorer, more anxious, and more disposable than it was promised it would be. That is the real indictment. Not that some funds made money, not that some deals worked, but that a broad system of incentives has been allowed to turn basic human needs into toll roads, then call the result innovation. I have seen enough markets to know that not every excess ends in one dramatic crash. Some forms of decline are slower. They look like constant pressure, like endless fees, like higher minimum payments, like smaller apartments, like delayed marriages, like skipped doctor visits, like parents working longer, like children leaving home later, like communities that once had owners and now mostly have operators. Those forms of decline are easy to normalize because they do not all arrive on the same day, but they are no less real. The young feel them first because they have the least accumulated protection from them. That is why I do not dismiss their frustration. Much of it is entirely rational. What I hope they do with that rational frustration is turn it into discernment rather than despair. See clearly, choose carefully, refuse unnecessary traps, build pockets of sanity, support people and institutions that still value stewardship, and remember that the future is not only damaged by the giants who loot it, it is also repaired by ordinary people who refuse, in thousands of daily ways, to think and live like looters themselves. That is where I would start. That is where I still start. And in times like these, starting there is not small at all.